The hum of the canteen grew louder as more people noticed the baby's solitary presence. Some instinctively looked around, hoping to spot a mother rushing back, but the seat beside the bench remained empty. Nate's cries, sharp and unrelenting, seemed to echo off the walls, bouncing back like a reminder of a reality no one wanted to acknowledge. Each shrill sound tugged at something deep within those who had gathered, awakening a mixture of fear, curiosity, and moral obligation. The first to act was a middle-aged woman with chestnut hair pulled into a tight bun, her apron dusted with flour from her duties behind the serving counter. She approached carefully, her movements deliberate. She lowered herself to Nate's level, trying to meet the panic in his eyes with warmth in her own. He reached instinctively for her, tiny fists scrabbling at the air, and when she scooped him up, a collective sigh of relief went through the crowd. Some clapped softly, as though that small act of kindness had somehow eased the tension pressing on the room. "Someone find his mother," she called, her voice firm but tinged with worry. But no one responded. The crowd seemed frozen in that suspended moment where uncertainty met judgment. Among them, whispers surged. "How could a young mother do this?" one woman muttered under her breath. "Abandon her own child?" Another shook her head, eyes wide with disbelief. "She must have been desperate, or cruel." A man in a blue suit, his tie slightly loosened and his hair mussed from a long morning of meetings, frowned as he watched. His fingers drummed nervously against his notepad. "This is unbelievable," he murmured. "Someone has to call the authorities. This is not safe. The baby could be hurt." Yet before anyone could move further, a stranger appeared from the back of the room. His presence was quiet but commanding. Not tall, not particularly imposing, he carried an aura of calm authority, as though he understood the fragility of what he held more than anyone else in the room could. Without a word, he stepped toward the woman holding Nate and held out his hands. "Let me take him," he said softly. The woman hesitated for a brief moment. Then, sensing the weight of his confidence, she handed the baby over. Nate's cries began to subside almost immediately, soothed by the stranger's steady embrace. His small body pressed into the warmth of a pair of arms that radiated quiet strength. The room's energy shifted. Where panic and judgment had dominated, now there was a space for observation, a pause in which the chaos could be measured, weighed, and slowly understood. The whispers continued, though their edge had softened. "Who is he?" one asked. "He's not her father, not a relative, I don't think." Another shook their head, sighing. "I've never seen him before. Maybe he's a worker here." No one spoke to him directly. They didn't have to. The baby, Nate, had already made a silent judgment, placing trust in the stranger who held him. And that trust, pure and unspoken, was enough to quiet the room, at least for a moment. Outside, Emily's footsteps carried her further away, each stride a desperate attempt to escape the knot of emotion and fear that had consumed her since the moment she left Nate on the bench. Her chest tightened with guilt, her throat burned with unshed tears, and yet she forced herself onward. She could not turn back. She could not face what she had done. Not yet, not when her own heart felt so fragile and raw. She wandered the streets near the canteen, her shadow stretching long in the afternoon sun. Cars passed, oblivious to the small tragedy she had left behind. People in shops glanced at her briefly, noting only a young girl who appeared tired, maybe anxious, but seeing nothing of the secret she carried. Every step was a battle between instinct and despair. Part of her wanted to run and reclaim what she had abandoned, to scoop Nate into her arms and erase the moment entirely. But a louder, darker part reminded her of the consequences, of the failure, of the unbearable weight of responsibility she could not yet bear. Meanwhile, back in the canteen, the stranger who had taken Nate into his care moved carefully, scanning the faces around him. There was no judgment in his eyes, no impatience, only focus. He examined the baby, noticing the trembling fingers, the uneven breathing, the slight redness around the eyes and cheeks. These small details spoke volumes of neglect, of sudden abandonment, of a fragile life momentarily adrift. Others began to step forward slowly. A young man offered to fetch blankets. A woman opened her bag and produced a bottle of water, unsure if it was needed but feeling compelled to contribute. Slowly, the room began to transform from a place of shock to a place of cautious action. Conversations continued, yes, but now tinged with practical concern rather than outright judgment. A few curious onlookers whispered stories about the girl who had left the baby. Some spoke of a young mother overwhelmed by circumstance. Others speculated about neglect or selfishness. No one could be certain. Everyone had an opinion, and in that uncertainty, the story began to grow, twisting and bending with every retelling. In the canteen, Nate's cries had set the stage for something far larger than anyone could have imagined. A story of abandonment, of human kindness, and of consequences that rippled outward faster than the initial act itself. Time moved differently in moments like these. Seconds stretched into minutes as the baby calmed in the stranger's arms. Conversations slowed to a low hum. People glanced around, measuring the situation, calculating what to do next, what the law might demand, what morality might dictate. And still, Emily walked further, carrying with her a burden that no one in the canteen could see. She had become a ghost in her own life, leaving behind only a trace of sorrow, a sound that would echo long after she was gone. The woman who had first reached for Nate watched him now, held securely by the stranger. Her expression softened, though her brow remained furrowed. She wondered silently about the mother, about the reasons that could drive a young girl to leave her child in a public space. Compassion warred with anger, pity with disbelief. She thought of her own children, or the children she had never had, and shivered at the idea of making such a choice. Other people in the room debated what to do next. Some argued that someone should call the authorities immediately. Others suggested trying to find the girl first, perhaps even tracking her down before involving law enforcement. There were those who argued it was none of their business, that the baby's mother would eventually return, that perhaps her absence was temporary, not permanent. But the longer Nate cried, the more urgent the situation felt. The stranger, however, remained focused on the child. He rocked him gently, whispering soft, rhythmic words that seemed meant not only to soothe but also to communicate something unspoken. It was as if he recognized that the baby was not merely a responsibility for the present moment, but a life that could be shaped, molded, and protected if he acted with care. He understood instinctively that this small life had been thrust into chaos through no fault of its own, and that for now, at least, it required stability, calm, and an unwavering presence. Outside, Emily paused near a small park, leaning against a lamppost and pressing her forehead to the cool metal. Tears ran down her cheeks, hot and unrelenting. The weight of her choice settled into her chest like a stone. She did not want to leave Nate behind, but she could not yet face the responsibility that clung to him like a shadow. She had hoped, foolishly, that someone would understand, that someone would take him and forgive her absence. But the truth was harsher. There was no forgiveness she could yet claim, no redemption to be had in that moment. The canteen's atmosphere continued to thrum with tension. Whispers grew louder as more people gathered near the entrance, drawn by the sound of crying and the promise of a story unfolding in real time. Some pulled out phones, perhaps to document, perhaps to call for help. Others simply watched, their expressions a mix of fear, curiosity, and incredulity. Nate, wrapped in the stranger's arms, became the center of the universe for those few minutes, a living embodiment of innocence caught in the crossfire of adult judgment. And then, as if on cue, a small hush fell over the room. The baby had grown quiet, lulled into a fragile calm by the stranger's presence. The hum of the canteen returned, though now tinged with a new tension, a sense that nothing would ever be quite the same again. Some patrons returned to their meals, though they glanced repeatedly toward the bench. Others lingered, unable to shake the feeling that they were witnessing the start of a story far larger than themselves. The first hints of gossip began to weave through the crowd. "I heard the mother is just a teenager," someone said softly. "Can you imagine? Leaving a baby alone like that?" Another voice answered, almost in disbelief, "I heard she's barely 16. It's awful, but maybe she's desperate." Desperate? The word hung in the air like smoke. No one knew what it truly meant for Emily. No one knew the nights she had spent crying alone, the loneliness, the fear, the exhaustion that had led her to this moment. They saw only the outward act, the baby left behind, the small body trembling in the hands of a stranger. And yet, even as judgment whispered in every corner, there was compassion too, faint but undeniable, threading through those who could not quite bring themselves to condemn a girl they did not know. The stranger held Nate a little tighter, his eyes scanning the room with quiet vigilance. Each movement he made was deliberate, measured, as though he understood that a single misstep could shatter the fragile equilibrium that had settled over the canteen. His calm presence acted as a counterbalance to the rising tension, a stabilizing force in a room that had become a maelstrom of opinions and whispered judgments. Nate's small hands clung instinctively to the fabric of the stranger's shirt. His cries had dwindled to soft hiccups, but the tension in his tiny body remained, a silent testament to the shock of abandonment. His blue eyes, so like Emily's, so innocent and unknowing, darted around the room, taking in the faces that peered at him with varying mixtures of curiosity, concern, and incredulity. For a moment, he seemed to understand, in some preternatural way, that he was now dependent on this unknown man who had stepped in without hesitation. Meanwhile, the murmurs among the onlookers grew more insistent. A young woman with a baby of her own, seated at a nearby table, leaned forward, her expression a mixture of sympathy and outrage. "How could anyone leave a child alone?" she whispered to her companion, her voice trembling slightly. "Does she even understand what she's done?" Her friend shook her head, glancing toward the doorway as if hoping the mother might return at any moment. "I don't know," she said softly. Maybe she had no choice. You don't know what's going on in her life." The debate, quiet but intense, began to ripple outward. Opinions clashed like waves on a rocky shore. Some people felt the act was unforgivable, a mark of selfishness and irresponsibility. Others, caught in the pang of empathy, wondered if desperation, fear, or sheer exhaustion had driven a young mother to such a decision. The tension in the room was almost palpable, a living thing that coiled itself around the tables, wrapping tight around every shoulder and neck, urging people to take sides, to choose judgment or compassion, to weigh morality against circumstance. In the midst of this, the stranger did not speak beyond murmured reassurances to Nate. He rocked the baby gently, his lips barely moving, his voice a soft hum that blended with the background clatter of the canteen. It was a lullaby without words, a signal that someone, at least, was present, someone whose responsibility could not be denied. Somewhere near the entrance, a man in a green jacket whispered to another patron, "We should call someone. The police, social services, someone needs to know." The other shook his head, hesitant. "No, not yet. Maybe she'll come back. Maybe it's not permanent. Let's not make assumptions." The argument ended there, unresolved, but the tension lingered like smoke. Everyone in the room had a stake in this small drama now, even if their connection was only that of witness. The baby, the abandoned infant, had created a nexus around which fear, compassion, judgment, and curiosity swirled. And the stranger, steadfast, held him in the eye of the storm, a living anchor against the tide of uncertainty. Outside, Emily wandered further, her steps carrying her past quiet streets, down alleys with chipped paint and faded signs. Each stride felt heavier than the last, as though gravity itself were pressing against her chest. Her hair, still shimmering faintly in the afternoon sun, hung in loose strands around her face, damp with sweat from the anxiety that gnawed at her. Her stomach churned, her throat burned with unshed tears, and her mind replayed the act she had committed again and again, like a relentless echo. She thought of Nate, her son, her responsibility, the living proof of a decision she had made and now could not undo. She hated herself for leaving him, yet feared the suffocating weight of motherhood had already claimed her. The thought of returning, of facing the faces in the canteen, of facing her own parents' inevitable disappointment, made her chest tighten with panic. She had tried, in her own way, to prepare for this life, to embrace it, to love him as she should, but she had failed. And now, leaving him, abandoning him, felt like the only path that might preserve even a fraction of what remained of her sanity. Back inside, the canteen continued to watch, wait, and murmur. A few of the staff members had gathered near the serving counters, offering quiet suggestions about blankets, food, or calling someone more official. The whispers had evolved into cautious planning, a slow choreography of human reaction. Someone suggested checking the parking lot to see if a car had left in a hurry. Another proposed asking the surrounding shops if they had seen a girl matching the description. Each suggestion, simple though it was, represented the human need to act, to intervene, to do something in the face of helplessness. The stranger, however, remained focused on the baby. He adjusted his hold, ensuring Nate's head was cradled safely against his chest, listening to the soft rhythm of his small heart, counting the breaths, observing the tiny movements, and calculating the best way to provide comfort without startling the child. It was meticulous, deliberate, and almost sacred. This was more than babysitting. It was an act of protection, of guardianship, of silent promise. From the corner of the room, an elderly woman watched with her hands clasped in front of her. Her eyes, sharp despite her years, softened as she observed the baby and the stranger. She had seen children abandoned before, young mothers driven by desperation and fear, and she knew the complexity behind the act. Compassion and judgment warred within her, but she remained silent, letting her gaze linger. In that look, one could see the recognition of pain, of human frailty, of mistakes made out of fear and exhaustion rather than malice. The tension in the canteen shifted subtly. The whispers continued, yes, but now punctuated by a quiet reverence for the stranger who held the baby. People began to realize, perhaps subconsciously, that judgment alone could not rectify the situation. They could speculate, they could guess, they could form opinions, but the child needed care, attention, and protection in the here and now. Meanwhile, Emily's shadow stretched across the sidewalks, her pace slowing as the weight of what she had done pressed ever more heavily against her chest. The city around her seemed indifferent, alive in its ordinary rhythms, oblivious to the drama she had left behind. Cars honked, pedestrians bustled by, dogs barked in the distance, yet none of it reached her fully. She was in her own world, suspended between guilt, fear, and an unspoken hope that someone, anyone, would protect Nate. Back in the canteen, one of the younger patrons, barely more than a teenager, leaned toward another. "Do you think she'll come back?" he whispered. His companion shrugged. "I don't know. I hope so. But what kind of mother leaves her baby here?" The words hung heavy in the air. Some nodded silently, others lowered their gaze. Yet beneath the judgment, a quiet current of empathy persisted. People could see the panic in the stranger's careful movements, the urgency in his whispers to the baby, the instinctive care that he offered. They could imagine, if only faintly, the chaos that had driven Emily to leave, the desperation, the fear, the loneliness. And somewhere in that collective observation, a subtle story began to form. Not the story of abandonment alone, but of humanity, the fragile, flawed, and yet profoundly capable humanity that could step forward when needed, that could care for those who could not care for themselves. Nate, oblivious to these human calculations, settled gradually into a fragile sleep against the stranger's chest. His breathing became regular, a small rise and fall that signaled momentary security. The room's tension eased, though not completely. The air still hummed with uncertainty, but now threaded through it was a faint, unspoken acknowledgement of hope, that perhaps, just perhaps, the child was in safe hands for the moment, and that his story was not yet written in despair. Time in the canteen moved in uneven pulses now, measured by the soft coos and hiccups of Nate, cradled safely in the stranger's arms. The room, once a swirl of confusion and whispered judgments, had grown quiet with attention. People lingered in their seats or stood near the edges, unwilling to leave, compelled by the tension that had settled like a heavy fog. They could see the baby's tiny chest rise and fall, the minute tremor of his fingers, the way his eyelids fluttered in exhaustion. And in those small, precise movements, they recognized vulnerability so raw and unguarded that it demanded care, demanded witness, demanded empathy. Some had begun to talk again, softly, carefully, almost as though speaking too loudly might disturb the fragile calm. "It's awful," a young woman said, her voice low. But maybe she didn't know what else to do. Another shook her head, her expression conflicted. 16 years old, how could anyone at that age make a decision like this? A man, perhaps in his 30s, leaned against a counter, arms crossed, lips pressed into a thin line. He had seen hardship before, had watched the world bend and twist around choices people made in desperation, but even he felt a pang of disbelief. His eyes softened slightly as they followed the stranger holding Nate. There was authority in the man's calm, an unspoken assurance that the baby would not suffer further in this moment. And yet, there remained a lingering, gnawing question: what would happen next? Outside, Emily moved like a shadow cast by her own guilt, her steps faltering as the enormity of her act settled in. She had not run away to escape her responsibility entirely. Rather, she had fled from the crushing weight of it, from the reality that she was still a child herself, unprepared to bear the life of another, however much she loved him. She imagined the baby crying, imagined the stranger holding him, imagined the murmurs of judgment and pity. Each vision twisted her heart, made it ache in a way that seemed almost physical, a raw, hollow pain she could not escape. Yet she pressed forward, unable to return, unable to face the inevitable confrontation with her parents, unable to bear the stares of strangers who could see the full weight of her failure. She told herself it was temporary, that she would return when she was ready, that someone else would care for Nate until she could gather the courage to face what she had wrought. But deep inside, a cold truth gnawed at her. This was no temporary measure. This was an act that would ripple through time, touching lives she had yet to understand, including her own. Inside the canteen, the stranger moved with careful deliberation. He adjusted his hold on the baby, whispering softly, rocking gently, and scanning the room. The patrons watched him with growing fascination, curiosity mingled with respect. He was a quiet figure in the center of chaos, a stabilizing presence, a reminder that amid confusion and panic, someone could step forward with clarity and purpose. One young mother, seated at a nearby table with her toddler in a high chair, whispered to her companion, "Do you think the girl will come back?" Her voice trembled, uncertainty woven into the question. "I don't know," her companion replied. "But whoever left him, whoever she is, she must be suffering too. You don't abandon a child unless you're desperate." The word desperate seemed to echo in the room, a recognition of human frailty. It was not justification, not forgiveness, but an acknowledgement of the complexity hidden beneath a single, heartbreaking action. At the far side of the canteen, a waitress wiped down a table, glancing toward the baby and the stranger with quiet awe. She had seen children left in worse circumstances, had seen lives marked by neglect, but there was something about this scene that struck her more deeply. Perhaps it was the innocence of the child, perhaps the steadiness of the stranger, perhaps the inexplicable, raw humanity of the moment. She felt her chest tighten, and for a heartbeat she imagined the mother, the girl who had walked away, and the unbearable weight she must carry. Meanwhile, whispers continued to swirl. A few patrons speculated about Emily's life, piecing together a story from fragments of rumor and observation. "I heard she's still in school," one said. 16, maybe 17. "Can you imagine being that young and having a baby?" "She must have had a boyfriend," another added, voice low, almost conspiratorial. "Probably promised to help and then left. It happens all the time, doesn't it?" The narratives grew with each retelling, fragments of truth entwined with speculation. No one knew the full story, yet everyone felt compelled to create one. It was a human reflex, the need to make sense of chaos, to frame events in patterns that fit our understanding, even when the truth remains hidden. The stranger, however, paid no attention to the gossip. His focus remained fixed on Nate. He adjusted the blanket wrapped around the baby, ensuring that his tiny body remained warm. He hummed a quiet rhythm, almost inaudible over the distant clatter of trays and chairs. Nate stirred slightly but did not cry. The stranger's presence had offered him a small sanctuary in a world that, moments ago, had seemed overwhelmingly frightening. Emily, still walking the streets, felt a sharp pang of guilt. Each step carried her further from the canteen, yet she could not escape the echoes of her son's cries. She imagined his wide eyes, the way his small hands would clutch at her shirt if she had been there, the fragile life she had left behind. Her stomach knotted with shame, her chest tightened, and yet she forced herself forward, clinging to the fragile hope that leaving him in capable hands would not forever mark her as a failure. Back inside, the scene continued to evolve. A small group of patrons had gathered near the door, debating quietly whether to attempt to locate the mother, whether to call authorities, or simply to wait. Their voices were hushed, respectful of the delicate situation, yet tinged with impatience and fear. They understood the stakes. A child left alone, even for minutes, was at risk. The strangers in the room were not just observers, they were participants in the unfolding drama, caught between judgment and action, morality and pragmatism. The stranger's calm presence had shifted the energy of the room. Where panic had once dominated, now there was a fragile sense of stability. Nate's breathing had slowed, his small body relaxed ever so slightly. The room, still alive with whispers, now watched in quiet fascination as the man carried out the unspoken responsibility thrust upon him. He did not speak of judgment or blame. He did not speculate about the mother or her circumstances. He simply acted, the way one does when confronted with life's raw, uncompromising fragility. And yet, even in this calm, there was tension. People's eyes occasionally flicked to the entrance, as if expecting Emily to return. The thought that she might come back at any moment hung over the room like a storm cloud. It was a story suspended in time, waiting for a choice, an action, a confession. What would happen if she returned? What would happen if she did not? Every heart in the room felt the weight of that question, though no one could answer it. Emily's journey continued in silence. She moved past empty streets, past quiet homes, past shops where the ordinary rhythms of life carried on untroubled by the storm she had created. Her mind replayed every decision she had made leading up to this moment. The choices, the missteps, the reckless pursuit of freedom, the abandonment of responsibility, the brief moments of joy that now seemed tainted by sorrow. Her chest ached with every memory, her throat burned with unshed tears, and yet she pressed forward, unable to return, unable to face the inevitable confrontation with reality. Inside the canteen, the story continued to unfold in its own deliberate rhythm. A few patrons had begun to consider what to do next in practical terms. Some offered to fetch supplies, some suggested calling someone with authority, and others simply remained in place, observing, witnessing, absorbing the magnitude of the moment. Each act, each suggestion, each whispered opinion contributed to the growing tapestry of human reaction, a complex web of judgment, empathy, and shared concern that coalesced around a single, tiny life. The baby, oblivious to the intricacies of adult reasoning, slept on. His chest rose and fell in gentle rhythm, his small fingers curled instinctively, and in his fragile slumber, he carried with him the weight of choices made by those around him, by his mother, by the stranger, by the witnesses who had assembled in the canteen. Each heartbeat, each breath, each flicker of eyelid was a testament to survival, to resilience, to the quiet, stubborn persistence of life even in the face of human imperfection. The minutes stretched into hours, though no one in the canteen would have noticed time passing in the usual sense. For them, the world had narrowed down to the bench, the baby, and the stranger who held him. Nate's breathing, once frantic and uneven, had settled into a gentle rhythm, a quiet signal that the immediate danger of abandonment had passed. And yet, despite the calm, the room remained taut with anticipation, every eye flicking toward the doorway as if expecting the mother to return at any second. The stranger adjusted Nate carefully, cradling him closer, feeling the subtle tremor in his small body. There was a softness in his arms that contrasted with the intensity of the situation, a gentleness that seemed almost instinctual. He whispered soft syllables to the baby, words without meaning, and yet each one carried a quiet reassurance. The baby's eyelids flickered in response, a tiny acknowledgement of comfort in a world that had suddenly become unfamiliar and frightening. A cluster of onlookers gathered at the side of the canteen, leaning against walls or huddling near tables, their expressions a mixture of curiosity and unease. "We should call someone," a middle-aged man muttered, adjusting his glasses nervously. "The police, social services, Someone has to know about this. But what if she comes back? A young woman asked, her voice trembling slightly. We can't assume she abandoned him completely. Maybe she's only gone for a moment. The debate remained unresolved, yet the undercurrent of urgency persisted. Each argument, each whispered theory, reflected the collective need to make sense of an event that defied ordinary understanding. No one wanted to feel powerless, and yet the reality was clear. Nate was alone, and his mother, for reasons no one could fathom, had chosen to leave him behind. Emily, in the meantime, wandered the streets with a numbness that seemed to consume her from within. She passed by storefronts and quiet lanes, her mind a swirl of regret, fear, and rationalizations that felt increasingly hollow. She had convinced herself that leaving Nate was an act of preservation, for him, for herself, but every step away from the canteen felt heavier than the last. She imagined his cries, his tiny fists, the way he must have felt abandoned, and the sight pierced her heart anew with every mental image. She tried to justify it, to tell herself that he was in safe hands, that the stranger who had taken him must be kind and competent. But rationalization only carried so far when guilt runs deeper than logic. Her thoughts spiraled, recalling each moment that had led to this, the reckless choices, the nights of defiance, the absence of a father figure, the emptiness of her friends who had drifted away. She saw, with brutal clarity, the consequences of her freedom, the price of rebellion paid in the tiny, fragile life of her son. Back in the canteen, the room had become a tableau of human reaction. A few patrons had stepped closer to observe, drawn by curiosity as much as concern. They noticed the stranger's methodical movements, the way he adjusted the blanket around the baby, how he whispered soft, steady syllables to soothe him. It was an almost sacred display of care, and it had a profound effect on those who watched. Some lowered their gaze, feeling the sting of their own judgment. Others simply stood silently, witnessing an act of humanity that contrasted sharply with the initial panic. The elderly woman in the corner, whose eyes had softened earlier, now spoke softly to a companion. "He's good with him," she said. "Do you see that? The baby feels it too. It's instinct. Some people, they just know how to hold what's fragile." A hush fell over the crowd, a quiet acknowledgement that sometimes, the act of stepping forward, of taking responsibility when no one else will, speaks louder than any words of accusation or sympathy. For the moment, the community's attention shifted from speculation about the mother to admiration for the stranger's composure, his ability to provide care without judgment. Emily's wandering eventually brought her to a quiet park, where the trees cast long shadows in the late afternoon sun. She leaned against the trunk of a large oak, feeling the rough bark press against her back as though the world itself were grounding her in reality. Her hands trembled, her body quivered, and the weight of her absence pressed upon her chest like a stone. She imagined Nate's wide eyes, the tears she had left on his small cheeks, the tiny fists that had clawed helplessly at nothing. She hated herself for leaving him, yet she feared returning more. The shame, the inevitable disappointment, the confrontation with both her parents and her own conscience, it all seemed unbearable. Each tear she fought to suppress burned against her eyelids, and every breath felt shallow, as if the act of respiration itself required negotiation with a heart too heavy to carry. Inside the canteen, the whispers of speculation continued, interwoven with acts of care. Some patrons suggested checking the surrounding streets, hoping to catch a glimpse of the mother. Others debated the morality of intervening in such a situation, unsure whether the act of leaving a child, though alarming, constituted immediate danger if the baby was now in safe hands. Each discussion, each fleeting judgment, reflected the human need to frame chaos within understanding, to find structure in a moment that defied ordinary logic. The stranger, however, remained impervious to the gossip. His attention was fully on Nate, on the small body trembling slightly against his chest, on the delicate rise and fall of the infant's breath. He adjusted the blanket again, humming soft, unstructured melodies that carried warmth and calm. His hands were steady, deliberate, and sure, as though he understood that this child's entire world had narrowed to the space between his arms and that it was his responsibility to provide the certainty the boy could not yet comprehend. Emily, in the park, sank to a low bench and buried her face in her hands. Her shoulders shook with silent sobs, each one a manifestation of guilt, fear, and despair. She had left her child behind, abandoned him not out of malice but out of desperation, and yet the act now felt permanent, an irreversible mark on both their lives. The park was quiet, the distant sounds of the city muted, and for the first time in hours, she allowed herself to feel the full weight of her choice. Back in the canteen, subtle changes in the energy of the room began to emerge. A few patrons approached cautiously, offering blankets, soft toys, or water. Their actions were small, but significant, a human acknowledgement that while they could not undo what had been done, they could intervene in the present. They became part of the silent covenant of care that had formed around the baby, a network of witnesses who bore responsibility in their attention and action. The elderly woman, whose eyes had remained soft throughout, leaned forward slightly, her hands clasped together in quiet prayer. "God bless him," she murmured, almost to herself. "May he be safe. May someone care for him." Her words, though silent to most, carried weight. It was a reminder that human compassion often manifests in small, understated ways, through whispers, through gestures, through attention given without expectation of reward. And in that small room, as the sun shifted and the afternoon waned, those acts combined to create a shield of safety around the fragile life in the stranger's arms. Emily rose from the park bench, trembling slightly, her hands still pressed against her face. She walked again, her mind a chaotic storm of fear, regret, and rationalization. She knew the longer she stayed away, the more difficult it would be to return. The thought of facing her parents, of confronting her own failures, of reclaiming responsibility for Nate, all of it seemed insurmountable. Yet the image of him, asleep and fragile, safe only because of a stranger she did not know, pulled at her heart in ways she could not deny. Inside, the canteen's patrons had grown quieter. The baby slept soundly, his chest rising and falling in a steady rhythm. The stranger hummed quietly, rocking him gently, and the room seemed to breathe with him. The collective gaze of the community softened, a tacit acknowledgement that while the act of abandonment was shocking, the response could be measured, deliberate, and compassionate. In that moment, the canteen became more than a place of food and routine. It was a microcosm of human response to crisis, a living testament to the ways people navigate moral ambiguity, fear, and the need to act when lives hang in balance. Each individual, whether through whispered speculation, quiet observation, or deliberate care, contributed to the unfolding story. And at the center of it all lay a baby, small, fragile, innocent, whose life had become the fulcrum around which these human energies pivoted. Emily, walking alone under the growing shadows of evening, felt the first tremors of clarity. She understood, more vividly than before, that her absence had consequences far beyond her immediate desire for relief. She also understood, with a growing sense of fear, that returning was inevitable. There would come a moment when she could not avoid the confrontation with both her child and the consequences of her choices. That moment, though distant, loomed on the horizon, pressing against her like a tide she could not escape. The stranger walked out of the canteen, Nate cradled securely in his arms, the small boy's breaths now even and calm. Outside, the sun was lower, casting long shadows over the pavement, but the warmth of late afternoon gave way to a subtle chill that pressed against the skin and reminded the stranger of how fragile this moment was. Cars passed in the distance, indifferent to the quiet drama unfolding on the sidewalk, while passers-by slowed slightly, curious about the man carrying a sleeping infant. He walked with care, mindful of every movement. The baby stirred once, a tiny whimper escaping, and the stranger adjusted the blanket around him. Each fold, each tuck, was deliberate. Nate's tiny hands flexed, gripping the edge of the fabric, searching instinctively for something stable to hold. The stranger hummed softly, a sound unconnected to any song but resonating with a gentle rhythm, a heartbeat in itself, a reminder that life continued despite chaos. The walk led him to a quieter street, lined with low brick buildings, shops with faded signs, and residential homes with gardens that smelled faintly of earth and sun. He paused at a small park bench, settling carefully so that the baby remained supported. The stranger observed him closely, noting every flicker of expression, every twitch of the tiny muscles, every sigh of exhaustion. Nate was small and fragile, but he was alive, and in this truth lay the weight of responsibility. Meanwhile, Emily wandered aimlessly, her path intersecting with streets familiar and strange in equal measure. The city seemed alive in a way that mocked her absence. Children ran past on bicycles, laughing freely. Couples strolled hand in hand, their conversation light and unconcerned. Mothers pushed strollers, their movements confident, purposeful, the rhythm of their lives uninterrupted by doubt or fear. Emily felt every contrast keenly, her own lack of direction mirrored in the weight pressing upon her chest. She thought of Nate constantly. His small face haunted her, eyes wide with confusion and fear. Each imagined cry pierced her, a reminder of what she had left behind. She hated herself for leaving him, yet she feared returning. The shame was a heavy garment she could not shed. Each step away from the canteen pressed upon her chest like a physical force, and the world seemed to move without her, indifferent and unyielding. Back at the park, the stranger adjusted Nate's position, observing the infant's reaction. The baby's breathing had settled into a slow, rhythmic pattern, yet the tiny body still trembled occasionally, as though reacting to the residue of panic that had gripped him moments before. The stranger's hands were steady, sure, movements deliberate. Each gesture conveyed calm, security, reassurance. The infant's trust, delicate and fragile, had transferred from the mother to him in a matter of minutes, an unspoken acknowledgement of care and protection. As the evening deepened, shadows lengthened, stretching across the pavement, the stranger considered the next steps. He needed to provide food, warmth, and shelter. Each small need had to be anticipated. He mapped out options quietly in his mind, supplies from nearby stores, temporary arrangements, potential contacts who could assist. His planning was methodical, deliberate. The weight of the child in his arms was physical, yes, but the weight of responsibility was far heavier, pressing upon his shoulders with an almost silent insistence. Emily, still wandering, eventually found herself near a quiet alleyway. She pressed her back against the cool brick wall, trying to ground herself, to steady the storm of guilt and fear raging inside her. Her thoughts circled endlessly, replaying the events of the day, the moment she left Nate on the bench, the crowd of strangers, the distant murmurs, the stranger who had stepped forward. Each memory was a blade against her heart, slicing through her attempts at rationalization. She hated herself, yet she also hated the circumstances that had forced her into this impossible choice. She had wanted freedom, autonomy, the fleeting joys of adolescence unburdened by responsibility. And now, at 16, she faced the consequences of rebellion, the loss of innocence, the permanence of motherhood, the knowledge that every choice she made from this moment forward would be measured not just by her own desires but by the life of her child. The streets grew darker as evening fell, and Emily's isolation deepened. She avoided familiar homes and familiar faces, knowing that any recognition would bring questions she could not answer. Her parents' disappointment loomed in her mind, their faces etched in memory, their voices heavy with unspoken sorrow. She imagined their reactions, imagined the weight of their judgment, and it twisted her stomach with fear. She could not return, not yet. Not until she had gathered the courage, or perhaps until she had exhausted every possibility of evasion. Meanwhile, the stranger moved with quiet purpose. He found a small corner of a nearby shelter, a place that was not empty but offered enough privacy to care for the child without interruption. He settled Nate carefully, ensuring the blanket was tucked securely, that the baby's head remained supported. He hummed softly again, watching as the tiny eyes fluttered closed, the fingers relaxed, the body finally beginning to release the tension that had accumulated during the day's trauma. Hours passed in this manner. The stranger maintained vigilance, speaking little, acting with quiet deliberation. Each movement was intentional, each action designed to provide comfort and safety. The baby, sensing the stability, began to sleep more soundly, the faint rise and fall of his chest a quiet testament to the bond that had formed in the wake of abandonment. Emily, at last, found herself sitting on a low curb in a deserted street, exhausted. Her thoughts wandered to Nate again, imagining the stranger's hands, imagining the lullaby of his hum, imagining the calm that had finally replaced the terror. Her chest tightened as the realization struck. She had left him in the hands of someone she did not know. She had traded immediate panic for the possibility of care, and in that choice lay both relief and terror. The night deepened, and the city quieted around her. Streetlights flickered on, casting pools of yellow against the pavement. Emily's shadow stretched long and distorted, a silent witness to her turmoil. She pressed her face into her hands again, allowing herself a few stolen tears, the first true acknowledgement of the pain she carried. Back at the shelter, the stranger remained vigilant. He had improvised a temporary bed for Nate, softening the surface with blankets and towels. He checked the baby's breathing, adjusted the positioning, and hummed again, the sound low, soothing, rhythmic. He observed the rise and fall of the tiny chest, the small movements of the fingers, the faint murmurs escaping lips. Each detail mattered. Each detail was life itself, fragile and demanding. Outside, Emily's steps were slow, unsteady, but inevitable. She did not know where she was going, only that movement might stave off the suffocating weight of her own guilt. Yet even as she walked, the image of Nate remained vivid in her mind. His wide, uncertain eyes, the tremor in his small body, the tiny hands reaching instinctively for comfort. She had left him, but he was not lost. That knowledge, small as it was, created a tension within her, a pull between escape and responsibility, between fear and instinct. The city slept lightly around her. Windows glimmered with muted light, occasional footsteps echoed off alley walls, distant horns sounded from busy roads far away. Emily moved through it all like a ghost, silent, unseen, carrying a burden too large for her frame. Each breath was laborious, each heartbeat a reminder of the choices she could not undo. Inside, the stranger had begun to plan for the night. He considered food, warmth, the baby's needs for comfort and safety. Each consideration was meticulous, deliberate, and compassionate. He did not question why Emily had left the child. He did not speculate on morality. He focused on what could be done in the present to preserve life, to maintain stability, to provide care. Outside, Emily eventually collapsed onto the steps of a small church, her head bowed, her shoulders shaking. She was exhausted, physically and emotionally drained. The night air was cool against her skin, but it could not penetrate the chill that gripped her heart. She thought of Nate, of the stranger, of the canteen, of the judgmental eyes and whispers, and she understood, perhaps for the first time, the permanence of her choices. In that quiet moment, surrounded by shadows and silence, she felt the full weight of abandonment, not as an act done lightly, but as a consequence of her own limitations, her own desperation, her own unpreparedness. She could not return yet, and yet she could not escape the gravity of what she had done. The stranger watched over Nate through the night, a sentinel of quiet determination. He hummed, rocked, and adjusted the blankets. He noted every shift in the baby's breathing, every flicker of the eyelids, every twitch of the tiny hands. Each action was deliberate, measured, intentional, a silent promise to protect, to care, to provide stability in a world that had, for now, been fractured by fear and abandonment. Outside, Emily's shadow remained long, her figure bent, trembling slightly, carrying with her a truth she could not yet confront. She had left a life in the hands of a stranger. The hours crawled onward, slow and deliberate, as the night deepened. The streets outside were empty now, save for the occasional distant figure, a solitary jogger, or the faint hum of a car. The city's rhythm had slowed, allowing space for reflection, for observation, for reckoning. Emily remained seated on the cold stone steps of the church, her arms wrapped tightly around herself as if to shield her fragile form from the chill of both air and conscience. She thought of Nate constantly. His cries, once so sharp and piercing, now replayed in her mind in muffled echoes, each one a reminder of the small life she had left behind. Meanwhile, inside the shelter, the stranger's vigilance never waned. Nate had fallen into a light sleep, his chest rising and falling with delicate regularity, Yet the man remained alert, attuned to every subtle movement. Each flicker of a limb, each minute change in expression, was recorded and processed instinctively. The stranger knew that sleep in this fragile stage was shallow, that a baby's security depended entirely on the presence of someone who could respond immediately and without hesitation. He adjusted the blanket once again, folding it carefully around Nate's tiny body to provide warmth and a sense of enclosure. The fabric smelled faintly of linen and detergent, clean but familiar in a way that seemed to comfort the baby. The stranger hummed softly, repeating the same unstructured melody that had calmed him earlier, the cadence steady and unbroken. Nate's fingers twitched in response, his body relaxing gradually as though recognizing a pattern, a rhythm that promised safety. Emily, far from the warmth and security of that shelter, shivered. She had moved from the steps of the church to a nearby park bench, pressing her back against its cold metal frame. Her mind raced with scenarios, possibilities, fears. She imagined the authorities arriving at the canteen, the judgment in the eyes of strangers, the accusations whispered under breath, the disappointment and anger of her parents. Each thought weighed heavily, pressing against her chest, tightening with every heartbeat. Her hands trembled as she pulled them into her lap. She closed her eyes, attempting to still the storm inside, but the images of Nate, tiny, vulnerable, abandoned, refused to relent. She had left him, she reminded herself, and yet she had not been able to escape entirely. The shadow of her choice stretched long and unyielding, an ever-present reminder that some actions cannot be undone, some mistakes cannot be erased. Back at the shelter, the stranger continued to observe Nate. His movements were deliberate but fluid, a careful balance between vigilance and the gentle imposition of comfort. He adjusted the baby's head, ensuring it was supported, and checked the position of the blanket to prevent cold drafts from reaching the small body. Each action was a quiet, unspoken pledge, to protect, to provide, to nurture. It was as if he understood instinctively that in this moment, the fragility of life demanded the precision of intent, the steadiness of presence, and the constancy of care. The night outside grew colder, the darkness stretching across the city like a vast, unfeeling blanket. Emily felt the chill penetrate through her thin jacket and into her very bones. She wrapped her arms tighter, curling slightly, attempting to preserve warmth she could not generate from within. She thought of Nate, of his small fists, his trembling body, the tiny whimpers that must have pierced the silence after she left. The weight of guilt settled more heavily with each passing hour, pressing against her lungs, constricting her breath. The stranger, sensing the subtle movements of the baby, continued to rock him gently. Nate's eyelids flickered, his fingers flexing slightly, and then, gradually, his breathing slowed, deepened. Sleep took hold, tentative at first, fragile in its onset, but steadying with each rhythmic motion. The man adjusted his hold once more, mindful of the baby's fragile spine, careful not to disturb the equilibrium that had finally been established. Emily, still in the park, pressed her palms to her face and let out a long, silent, shuddering breath. She thought of Ryan, the boy who had abandoned promises as easily as he had abandoned her, leaving her to navigate the tumultuous waters of adolescence, pregnancy, and early motherhood alone. She remembered the way he had smiled, the way he had charmed, the ease with which he had dissolved into absence when reality demanded responsibility. The betrayal, layered atop the weight of her own decisions, gnawed at her from within, eroding any sense of clarity or purpose. Time continued its inexorable passage. The streets darkened further, and the distant glow of streetlights cast faint, trembling patterns across concrete and asphalt. Emily remained motionless, wrapped in her internal torment, while the stranger maintained his vigil over Nate. The contrast between the two, one consumed by guilt and fear, the other by deliberate care and presence, was stark, a quiet testament to the divergent paths forged by choice and circumstance. The canteen, now emptied of most patrons, was a residual space in the memory of those who had witnessed the initial chaos. Whispers lingered like smoke in the corners, conversations replayed in minds, judgments formed and reformed with each retelling. Some spoke of abandonment, some of desperation, some of morality and culpability. The stranger, of course, was absent from their speculation. He had become a figure outside of judgment, defined solely by his actions, his care, his unwavering presence. Emily's thoughts wandered to what would happen next. She imagined the authorities, the social workers, the inevitable interventions that would arise once the situation became known. She imagined herself explaining, justifying, begging for forgiveness. The anticipation of confrontation was paralyzing, yet unavoidable. Each imagined scenario carried with it a sting, a reminder that actions taken in fear and desperation are rarely easily rectified, rarely met with understanding or mercy. At the shelter, the stranger continued to rock Nate gently. He hummed low and soft, aware of the fragile thread of trust that had formed between them. The baby stirred occasionally, tiny fists flexing, eyelids fluttering, but never fully waking. The stranger adjusted the blankets again, folding them with care, mindful of every movement, every temperature change, every subtle shift in the child's posture. He observed the baby's breathing, noting its steadiness, its rhythm, the small sounds that signaled life and health. Emily, meanwhile, rose from her park bench, shivering, unsteady on her feet. She walked again, slowly, hesitantly, through streets that seemed unfamiliar despite their proximity to home. Every passerby, every lit window, every sound became a reminder of the life she had left behind. She felt both invisible and exposed, as though every action she took was being scrutinized by unseen eyes. The night seemed endless, the weight of absence unrelenting. Back in the shelter, the stranger prepared a small meal for Nate, carefully mashing softened food to an appropriate consistency, ensuring the temperature was safe, the texture suitable. He observed the baby's reactions closely, noting each facial expression, each tiny movement. The act of feeding was more than sustenance. It was an extension of care, a reinforcement of trust, a small reclaiming of normalcy in the aftermath of abandonment. Emily paused under a street lamp, her shadow stretching long and distorted across the pavement. She pressed her hands against her face again, imagining Nate's small body, the way he must have felt in the stranger's arms, the warmth and safety she could not provide at that moment. The mixture of relief and terror collided within her chest. She had left him, yes, but he was alive. He was safe. And yet, the knowledge that she had failed him remained, a constant, heavy pulse against her conscience. The night wore on. Emily eventually found herself sitting on the steps of an old apartment building, curled slightly, her head bowed, her hands wrapped around herself. The weight of guilt, fear, and regret pressed relentlessly, each breath shallow, each heartbeat heavy. The city slept lightly around her, indifferent to her struggle, unaware of the fragile life in the arms of a stranger just a few blocks away. Inside, the stranger maintained his careful attention. Nate had become more settled, the rhythm of his breathing even, the tiny fingers relaxed. He adjusted the blankets once more, noting the small rise and fall of the chest, the subtle movements of the hands, the quiet murmur that escaped lips in sleep. Each detail mattered, each observation was critical, each action a deliberate, careful step toward ensuring the child's safety. Emily's thoughts continued to circle, returning again and again to Nate. She imagined the eventual confrontation, the questions, the explanations, the apologies she would have to offer. Each imagined scene brought both dread and a strange, aching anticipation. She could not yet face the reality of her choices, yet she could not escape it either. The gravity of her abandonment had taken root, and its consequences would follow her relentlessly. The stranger hummed once more, the soft, unstructured melody filling the quiet shelter. Nate stirred slightly, then settled again, lulled by the steady cadence. The night passed in small, deliberate increments, marked by observation, care, and unwavering presence. Outside, Emily's figure remained tense, hunched against the cold, caught between the desire to flee and the inevitable pull of responsibility. She was a young mother, unprepared, isolated, and consumed by fear, yet tethered to the life of her child in ways she could neither ignore nor fully embrace. Morning came slowly, pale light seeping through the cracks of the shelter's windows. The stranger remained vigilant, watching Nate's tiny body as he shifted slightly in sleep. Every sigh, every flutter of eyelids, Every minute movement was catalogued in silent awareness. The child was still fragile, still vulnerable, yet the stranger's presence had begun to create a thread of security, tenuous but unbroken. He adjusted the blanket once more, ensuring warmth, folding the edges carefully around the small body, and hummed softly, a low and deliberate cadence that seemed to soothe the baby's restless subconscious. Emily had not slept. She had wandered through the city streets, her feet carrying her in instinctual patterns that avoided familiar places and the proximity of potential recognition. Her mind was a storm of thought, guilt, fear, and despair. Every step reminded her of the act she had committed, leaving Nate on the canteen bench and disappearing into the anonymity of night. She thought about the consequences, about her parents, about the strangers who had witnessed her abandonment, about Ryan, whose absence had left her entirely alone to navigate the treacherous waters of motherhood. The streets were quieter in the early morning hours, the hum of distant traffic soft and intermittent. Emily finally found herself at the edge of a park, the grass damp with dew, the air crisp. She sank onto a cold bench, her hands gripping the edges tightly, as though holding on might tether her to some fleeting sense of stability. She pressed her forehead against her palms, imagining Nate's tiny body, the warmth he had received in the stranger's arms, the lullaby of humming that had calmed him, and the slight, bittersweet relief that he was still alive. Yet relief was fleeting. The weight of her decision pressed heavily against her chest. She had left him, yes, but the knowledge of his well-being in another's care did not erase the act itself. It only amplified the tension between fear and guilt, between instinct and rationalization, between the desperate desire for freedom and the inescapable reality of responsibility. Inside the shelter, the stranger prepared a simple breakfast. He mashed soft cereal with water to an appropriate consistency, carefully testing the temperature before offering it to Nate. The baby stirred, small fingers flexing, eyes half open, adjusting instinctively to the presence of sustenance. The stranger fed him slowly, observing each reaction, noting every subtle movement, the flicker of eyelids, the faint noises that signaled hunger or contentment. Each small action was deliberate, a measure of care that balanced attentiveness with gentle patience. Emily rose from the park bench, compelled by the need to move, to escape the suffocating weight of her own thoughts. She wandered through streets that grew busier as the city awakened. Shops opened, buses rattled down familiar avenues, children's voices echoed from nearby schools. And yet, she moved like a ghost, unnoticed, unanchored, carrying within her the heavy knowledge that she had left a life behind in the hands of a stranger. Back at the shelter, the stranger cleaned Nate's small face, wiping traces of sleep and remnants of food with deliberate care. The baby's fingers curled slightly, clutching the edge of the blanket instinctively, searching for comfort. The stranger adjusted his hold, careful to provide support and security, maintaining a steady rhythm that promised stability. He hummed once more, a sound that seemed to reinforce trust, a signal that this moment, fragile as it was, contained safety and protection. Emily's mind wandered to her parents. She remembered the disappointment etched in her father's eyes, the tears that had marked her mother's cheeks. She recalled their words, heavy with love and concern, their attempts to guide her, to steer her away from the reckless path she had chosen. And yet, despite the pain, she understood the truth in their warnings. She had acted out of fear, out of desperation, out of the overwhelming weight of choices she could not yet bear. And now, separated from Nate, she faced the enormity of her decisions in isolation. The stranger had begun to arrange a small space for Nate in the shelter, clearing a soft area with blankets and towels, creating a semblance of comfort and routine. Each item placed carefully, each movement deliberate, an unspoken promise to care for the child with steadfast attention. He understood instinctively that in this moment, Nate's survival and sense of security depended entirely on the presence of someone willing to bear the weight of responsibility without judgment or hesitation. Emily walked aimlessly, eventually arriving at the edge of a quiet residential street. The houses were mostly dark, the early morning stillness palpable. She paused beneath a streetlight, her shadow stretching long across the pavement, and pressed her hands against her face again. She could almost see Nate in the stranger's arms, hear the gentle hum, imagine the tiny fists curling and unclenching, and feel the distance of separation like a physical pain. The stranger watched Nate as he shifted slightly, murmuring low, comforting sounds. He adjusted the blanket and the child's position with meticulous care, mindful of every movement, every reaction. He observed the rise and fall of the chest, the subtle twitch of fingers, the faint sound of murmured breath. Each action, deliberate and precise, reinforced the stability he had created, the security he offered in the wake of abandonment. Emily eventually found herself sitting on the steps of a small, abandoned building. The cold stone pressed against her back, her hands wrapped tightly around her knees. She closed her eyes, imagining Nate's tiny face, the security he had found in the stranger's care, the rhythm of the hum that had soothed him through the night. Relief mixed with guilt, comfort mingled with despair, and the weight of responsibility pressed down with relentless insistence. The streets around her were waking slowly. Distant voices, the hum of engines, the faint clatter of footsteps echoed through the alleys and avenues. Yet she remained in her own orbit of thought, her own spiral of self-recrimination and longing. She had left Nate behind, and though he was alive, though he was safe, the reality of abandonment pressed upon her relentlessly. Inside the shelter, the stranger continued his careful attention. Nate stirred, small fingers flexing, and the man responded instinctively, adjusting the child's posture and the positioning of the blankets. He hummed again, the soft, steady cadence providing a framework of safety. The baby's eyes flickered open briefly, observing the calm presence before him, and then closed again, soothed by the rhythm and the care surrounding him. Emily's thoughts turned to the future, to what might come next. She imagined confrontations, explanations, apologies, the inevitable judgments of society and family. She envisioned herself returning to the canteen, facing the whispers, the accusatory stares, the judgment that would surely follow. And yet, she could not yet move forward. Fear, shame, and exhaustion held her in place, her body curled tightly against itself, mind trapped in a cycle of anticipation and regret. The stranger had begun to improvise a routine, understanding instinctively that stability required consistency. He checked the baby's feeding schedule, arranged blankets, monitored breathing, and hummed intermittently. Each detail mattered. Each action reinforced security and trust. Each careful movement ensured that the fragile balance of the child's world remained intact despite the chaos that had preceded it. Emily rose once more, compelled by a mixture of fear and instinct. She wandered through streets, avoided populated areas, and searched, in some unconscious way, for a path to redemption. Each step was heavy, each movement uncertain, yet the awareness of Nate's continued survival provided a tenuous tether to hope. Inside the shelter, the stranger watched as Nate stirred, slight movements of tiny limbs, faint murmurs escaping lips. The rhythm of care continued, deliberate and meticulous, each action reinforcing the safety and stability that had been established. In that quiet vigil, a bond formed, silent but profound, rooted in the delicate trust of a life too small to navigate the world alone. Emily eventually paused in a quiet courtyard, her body hunched, her hands pressed against her face. The weight of abandonment, of guilt, of fear pressed relentlessly, each breath shallow, each heartbeat a reminder of her failure and her responsibility. She imagined Nate's small fists, the way he had sought comfort, the lullaby of humming that had soothed him in her absence. Relief and regret collided violently within her, each emotion pressing against the other, leaving her unsteady, unanchored, yet aware that she could not remain motionless forever. Back at the shelter, the stranger continued to observe, adjust, and care. The baby's breathing was steady, the fingers flexing slightly, eyelids fluttering. Each adjustment reinforced the sense of security, each hum reinforced trust, each action quietly but undeniably declared, "You are safe, you are seen, you are not alone." The night receded fully, and the first light of dawn stretched over the city. Emily, exhausted and raw, realized that the hours of wandering and self-recrimination had brought no resolution. She had left a life in another's hands, and the weight of that truth pressed upon her relentlessly. She could not undo what had been done, and yet she could not ignore it.